The OUCE, that is the Oxford University Centre for the Environment, has three parts: the School of Geography, the Environmental Change Institute and the Transport Studies Unit. The School of Geography has about nearly 300 undergraduates, about 120 master's students, 140 PhD students. The ECI has more than 60 researchers. They're basically a research program, large research profile, both in the UK, Europe, internationally. And the Transport Studies Unit, similarly, is a research program that has a big interest, basically, in sustainable transport. I think our program is policy-oriented, particularly on the social science side. For example, ECI has been very successful talking about the carbon footprint of aeroplanes, air travel, been very successful talking about energy use in household consumer products, those kinds of things. But the program combines physical science,
yes,
all the way through to social science and humanities. And on the physical science side, we have some of the best researchers around who are dating climate change and modelling, if you like, global climate systems. And I think they have a lot to say about the consequences of climate change for Africa.
So good science must undergird good policy.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, though, that's true, but you have to choose which part of science you do. So we really do two parts of science. One part is, if you like, long-term ecological change, and the other part is long-term climate change, dating it, modelling it. You can't do everything. Well, I was struck by what I heard. I mean, I think people ought to take more seriously the prospects, the consequences of climate change on Africa. I think it's too easy to talk about adaptation, too easy to talk about incremental change, where in fact what we'll face over 25 to 50 years could be quite catastrophic change. And I think for a variety of reasons. One is that the sheer change in temperature gradients is going to be significant. It will affect the drying of the continent. It will affect the availability of water. But it's going to affect people who are already vulnerable, who are already often at the margin of sustainability. And I think the combination of the temperature gradient plus their vulnerability is going to give us more than incremental change. It's going to give us more than adaptation. We as a world are going to face really the prospect of enormous changes, adverse changes in Africa. I think there's reason to take pessimistic scenarios seriously. I think there are probably sort of three levels of intervention. One is to ensure that local capacities for making their own, if you like, responses to change. We build local capacity. I think that's terribly important. And I mean local capacity, whether in political institutions or in neighbourhood, community, regional capacities. That's very important. The second one is to recognise really we have a huge stake in their prospects.
We being
the developed world, we being Western Europe,
yes.
Because I think the adverse scenarios in Africa could well affect us in the sense of the poverty, the sheer weight that's going to be imposed on a whole continent, and that will affect our prosperity. And I think the third thing is to make steps towards integrate. That is, I'm quite a strong advocate of globalization. And I think if we're going to build capacity, if we're going to take seriously Africa's prospects in relation to our own prosperity, we must integrate Africa into the global economy to their advantage. And I don't think there's any solution in withdrawing up the drawbridge, if you like, of Europe and saying we will have to look after ourselves. I hear that talked about a bit. I talk about our moral obligation. That may be true, but I'm afraid to say in the hard realities of global economic integration, I don't think that carries a lot of weight. I think it is terribly important in talking about moral obligation in the sense of mobilizing community and if you like, national opinion. But I think you have to make the deal between moral obligation and economic realities. And that's what I'm stressing. What are the economic realities here about the consequences of climate change on Africa? How do we actually sustain the development of Africa to their own advantage and then to our advantage? I think that's very important. When you look at countries that are leading on climate change in terms of policy, you don't identify the UK. Now, there are much worse countries. The United States has been, I think, a real constraint on global policy initiatives over the last decade. The UK is making gestures, but I think a lot of the discussion about policy is around tax policy. It's around incremental adaptation of behaviour, which I don't think really takes seriously the structural issues underpinning really a larger climate change agenda. And I think actually it's one of the points you were making. In some respects, the European Union, European Commission, because they're not wedded to national politics and national sort of game playing about relative position or trading off different constituencies, seem to have had a broader, bigger agenda. And I think a lot of the best UK policies actually have come from Europe. And that's actually really to be taken seriously. The other thing I'll say is that national policy making or EU policy making is not going to be successful unless you engage global corporations in the issues, and actually they are part of the solution. We are in a very different world than 1950 in terms of the relative power of corporations in respect to nation state. Global corporations are the engine of the future of the 21st century. They must be intimately involved. There are many difficulties that Africa faces. Some of the difficulties we impose on Africa, for example, trade policies that discriminate against Africa are legion and legendary. There's many, many. In fact, even today, Camilla's presentation pointed to basically American rice growers affecting basically the African market for rice. Well, I think that's just catastrophic in terms of consequences. So we impose constraints on Africa's development potential by our own trade policies, but also African capacities in terms of entering into the global marketplace are quite limited at the moment. But it's not just the capacity of nation states or governments, it's the capacity of civil institutions, of firms, corporations to enter the global marketplace. That's, I think, an important part of the deal. I don't know. You have to go back to the history of Europe and the history of the European Union, European Commission, and see them as a response to a catastrophe. I think those kinds of institutions are in reaction to something. And you know, when you look for the roots or the rudiments that might build that capacity in Africa, you have to ask what's going to initiate that. And maybe climate change is it, but maybe not. I think there's many people are doubtful about the capacity of nation states, national elites to have that kind of collective sense of Africa's future. I think over the 21st century, Africa is going to bear an enormous burden of climate change. African people are going to be incredibly affected if some of the worst case scenarios are realised. I think Africa's prospects are in their own hands, but also in how we build their capacities, collaborate with them in terms of basically giving Africa entry into the global economy. I think it will provide the best opportunities for Africa, but again, to reiterate, climate change is not going to be the same, equal and everywhere around the world. Africa, more than almost any other continent, is going to bear an enormous burden, and we must take that seriously. We don't at the moment.